Hi, hello. I'm Nora Herting, founding CEO of ImageThink and host of Ask the Expert. Welcome to November's edition. This is a series where I sit down mostly monthly with experts in their fields. And it's your opportunity, if you're joining us on LinkedIn, to ask questions and get real time answers from experts in a host of fields. And I'm very excited about this month's series for a couple of reasons. I don't know about you, but during 2020, I developed a new appreciation for film and TV. It really saved me and kept me sane. And we have our two guests today, Marisa Ronca and Linn, are from backgrounds of film and TV. They're founders also of Contrast Media Consulting. And at Contrast, they provide their expertise in long form storytelling to create customized content strategies for companies to generate libraries of assets. But really, I'm going to turn it over to them to hear a little bit more about what they do before we dive in and talk about creative collaboration, storytelling. And if we're lucky, we might have a guest appearance from Chris's adorable puppy named Penny, who is joining us in the studio as well. Why don't I turn it over to you, Marisa?
Oh, hi. Well, thank you for having us. We're very excited to be here. Um, I don't know if you want us to just, both Chris and I are longtime creative executives and producers from networks. We have different backgrounds, but we came together most recently at True TV, where we oversaw, Chris oversaw the network, I oversaw production and development. And in our new consultancy, which is, I think, what you asked us about, we're kind of taking a natural evolution from what we did there out to clients on various platforms and also brands, talking to them directly about how they can harness the power of long form storytelling for themselves.
Well said.
Whew. Come.
And well, Chris, I mean, you feel free to add on to that. Besides being the puppy dad of Penny, you have also a really interesting background in a lot of what we would consider really creative companies. You want to tell us a little bit about your work there?
Sure. I started out, I was a theater major in college and, thought I wanted to be an actor, quickly learned I was not a triple threat, and then sort of applied my creative towards behind the scenes. I was, fortunate to start my career at Nickelodeon at a time when Nickelodeon was just taking off as a cable network. And, I worked on hundreds of episodes of shows there that, a lot of people who may be watching right now probably grew up with. And it was this incredible schooling in not only just developing creative and producing creative, but Nickelodeon in particular is was amazing at building franchises, like understanding the value of characters and formats that can have a life across not only on television but also as live events and in different formats, which is informing a lot of what Marissa and I are looking to do right now with Contrast Media is, how do you develop original IP that connects with people, that can, not only be a positive rub on your brand, but that is actually its own asset in and of itself. Anyway, I learned a lot there at Nickelodeon. I helped to launch the Spike television network. I was the head of programming at MTV for many years. I helped develop Jersey Shore and Catfish and a number of other franchises there. And then I came to True TV at a time when it was looking to rebrand from a reality network into something that would be perceived as a little bit more premium. And that's where I met Marissa. And together we rebranded it as a comedy network, and built an incredible team there. And, had a tremendous success there with franchises like Impractical Jokers, which is a show that Marissa, bought before I came to the network. But together we really built it up into something that wasn't just a hidden camera prank show, but is also a social media phenomenon. Is There's a live tour, and at the end of our time at True, we produced feature films. So that's kind of the arc, I
Wow,
guess.
yeah, and thinking about franchises or the strategy behind it, as the audience, definitely very watched a lot of Nickelodeon as a kid, and even thinking right now about the green slime,
Mhm.
those things that stick become so relevant and so personal to an audience, but it sounds like those things, there's a lot of strategy behind them, that it's not just around creating the content, but there's a lot of strategy around how you, what that brand is. And even the idea of a franchise or creative franchise was something that was new to me when talking with you, to think
Hmm.
about, being on the receiving end of great content and not necessarily being aware that it's actually a whole strategic maneuver where different assets then go on and, become spin-offs, whatnot. When we were chatting, you mentioned something about making a hit, that I'm going to
Hmm.
ask you about now, since you talked about so many hits that you and Marisa have been involved in. And, I imagine I've been in sessions before, not around film and TV, but where basically that's the idea is like, what is our iPhone, for this company, or what is our kind of golden ticket? And, what is your idea when a client comes to you and you've been in these creative sessions and they're telling you, we want to hit, we want something to go viral, right? We want to meme.
Right.
Uh, is there really a process for that, or how do you see, what's the secret behind those things that do become those hits and those
Right.
classics?
I mean, I have strong opinions about this, and Marissa, you should jump in afterwards because she may have a different take on it.
Yeah.
Because we don't always agree, which is a good thing. But my feeling is that you cannot. I don't believe that you can engineer with any certainty a hit. People will tell you, "Oh, I know when something's a hit. We're going to make this hit, etc." My experience in 30 years in this business is the things that became true hits that really broke out into the zeitgeist and just exploded were never the things that you thought were going to be the hits. Um, Now, I've known when I felt real certainty that something was going to be successful, but a true hit is something that the audience finds, the consumer, the world finds, and it's serendipity of you've created this thing that's meeting a need or an expectation or satisfying in some way, but it's meeting a moment in time for the viewer or the consumer that they take it and then they run with it. Something like Jersey Shore at MTV. I knew nobody wanted to touch that show in the beginning because it was like another loud reality show. And at the time, the network was trying to move towards something more aspirational and sophisticated. So nobody wanted to touch that show. But there was something about it. There was a mixture of sort of comedy and outrageousness. They had their own vernacular. They looked like nobody else. They spoke like nobody else. So there was a freshness, there was an unexpected element of it that we found just looking in the early cuts to be super satisfying. So there was a spark there. There was something there, and I think it happened to come out at a moment like the recession was hitting the country at the time. Some people were losing their homes. Things were happening, and here was this group of young people who were living life with no responsibilities, no anything, and it was fantasy fulfillment, and the audience took it and ran with it. So I think you can, you try to make something successful by pulling the right elements together. Hopefully it aligns with your brand, it supports your brand, it's something that or believe that your audience will connect to. But in terms of engineering a hit, I think there's an alchemy that happens when those pieces come together. You can set it up for success, but you can't really guarantee it. And trying to replicate a hit is the absolute best way to fail. I don't
Hmm.
know, Marissa, you may have a different take.
I agree with all that. The only thing I would add is like what we would do, and I think the same thing that MTV would do, but what we would do at True or TLC is the main thing that you can do as a developer is you just need to know the audience.
Yes.
Who is the audience that you have? Who is the potential audience that you can gain? And you need to know everything you can about them. And that helps you then super serve them with the programming that you're making. There's no guarantee that they is going to speak to them, but it helps guide you in a way in the early development phase. And the other thing that can be helpful in terms of like creating a hit or leaning into something is fandom. I think, especially with comedy, when we were able to see that certain people or certain ideas, when there was already like brewing fandom around it, that's something that you can really feed and add fuel to help launch something, as a hit. But I agree with Chris 1,000%. There was things that I thought would maybe be hits that weren't, and other things that are surprises. And that's,
But that's a great
Yeah,
point. Sorry, that's a
I,
great point that Marisa just made in terms of being prepared. Whether you're a television network, whether you own a brand, being in touch with how a piece of content's resonating and then being prepared to amplify it and multiply it and jump on it. You cannot wait there. There's a moment in time where when something starts to gain momentum, if you have to be there to amplify it immediately or you will lose that moment. And I think a lot
Mm-hmm.
of businesses tend to be conservative and tentative, or hesitant, to sort of put a ton of investment or time or energy behind something, and they lose those opportunities to help build something into it.
yeah, that's great. And I got excited because this is where I think we can kind of unpack some things that resonate for whoever's joining us, live on LinkedIn or after the fact, right? Is how do we apply some of these things if your domain is not reality TV, but knowing your audience is something that I think resonates. I know for the work we do at ImageThink that we're often asking our clients, we're either helping support our clients in sessions where they're really trying to dive deep and have, whether it's understanding empathy maps or understanding the audience or helping them really think through that audience so that we can position the content for them in the way that's going to be best consumed or best understood or best received. So, knowing an audience, that's great to hear you say that that's really kind of one of the only things that you have as a tool when you kind of throw things out there and see what resonates with the group. But then I'm also hearing, that being able to maybe, would you say, uh, be flexible, be spontaneous, or be nimble around when you start to see that fandom or those things resonate? Like, is there a certain amount of pivoting or flexibility that helped in your careers kind of jump on and fuel things that were starting to ignite in audiences, that kind of fandom and the potential to be a big hit?
Absolutely. I mean, I think with a franchise like Impractical Jokers at True TV, we were fortunate to have a fantastic, marketing and social team that were constantly monitoring how the audience was responding to the content and what was connecting with them the most. And, that would help us inform strategies in terms of how we promoted the show, in terms of how and when we made it available. And it gave us a lot of information around the elasticity of content that's in the show. It's a hidden camera prank show, but there's sort of a mythology. There's characters and terms that sort of live in the background that we could then sprinkle throughout all of the different types of content that we're putting out there. Sort of like little Easter eggs for the audience to spot and to engage with. We would have pop up like museums of impractical history with props and elements from the show, and fans would, at Comic Con, you would have thousands of fans lining up for hours to come in and see these things from this like little hidden camera prank show. But when you're feeding the audience's desire to connect more with something in any way that they can, whether it's seeing a prop, whether it's interacting with the talent, whether it's seeing a behind the scenes process, it deepens their engagement, it deepens their fandom and their passion for it. And I think all brands should be thinking about that, because more and more businesses are thinking that way, and that's sort of what it takes to engage and maintain the attention of your consumer.
Great. So we got our first question in, and her question is, when trying to create a franchise, what is the most impactful, the talent or the format? Mm,
Marissa, what do you say? I know my answer.
I think
Oh,
Marissa's
Marissa
frozen.
frozen.
So
Well, my
hear from
answer
you.
would be talent. I think it's talent. I think there are, formats key in terms of supporting the talent. But I think that people really connect emotionally with something based on the talent first and foremost, and then the format and the execution and everything sort of supports around that. But I always bet on talent first.
Bet on talent. That's great. So as we're thinking about, and I kind of think that about that as sort of the creative process too, and the creative thinkers and the masterminds kind of behind whether they're delivering it or conceiving it. And we were having a conversation, kind of in our virtual green room, if you will, around bumping up against ideas or maybe preconceptions or misunderstandings about creativity in the creative process when working with other people. Because here you are now. You were in TV land, production land, and now you're moving kind of into a place where you're adding and unpacking that for other clients and other
Mhm.
companies. And as you do that, as you move from being in super creative spaces and brands like Nick, Spike TV, MTV, TLC, what have you encountered? I'm curious around how other industries maybe approach creative thinking and the creative process.
Well, I think, because we've been in this world for so long, you take for granted that sort of what you know and how you work is what everyone knows and how everybody works. And so I think in like an early meeting we had with one client, we sort of launched into what we would deliver creatively, and got into a ton of detail about all the different elements and like the full franchise plan. And they came back to us, and their first question was, "So where does an idea come from?" And it really told us it's like, oh, wait a second, we can't assume that they understand the creative process and how all of that works. We really have to start from the beginning, and we have to find words that they understand. We have to speak in a language that they're more comfortable with, and can't just sort of start where we would normally start. I think there's a lot of misconceptions though about the creative process. Even within the creative industry, I think a lot of people think, as a development executive, people come and pitch you amazing story or show ideas all day long, and you just pick the ones you like the most. The reality is there are really no original ideas. There are maybe fresh executions of ideas, but there are very few good ideas. I think most development executives spend most of their time listening to really mediocre or misguided or ill-fitting ideas for your brand. And your job is to look to find those nuggets of where something does have real potential, to either align with your brand or with your audience, hopefully both, and to sort of discern, can you develop that into something that has the capacity, has the legs to connect with an audience for a long period of time across multiple episodes, etc. Or in another business, is this a piece of content that will meet your business needs, will help you achieve your business goals in a way that's engaging and entertaining, for your audience. So it's a real combination of science and art. No two projects ever come together the same way. So there's no formula that you can deliver to a client and say, here's how this works. Here's how you'll get from A to B, and I guarantee that you'll receive C. It's a unique process each time, and there's a certain amount of risk involved. There's simply no guarantees. That's not that, creative content development is not that kind of a business. But when it works, it's magic, and it delivers, tenfold. So it's worth it.
Yeah, that's where, this aspect is kind of where I want to like talk shop with you too a little bit, because we have run into that too. And I've actually been, even when I'm being interviewed, sometimes people ask, well, how do you convince, these skeptics, or, you're working for very quantitative companies that are looking for, something very concrete, whether it be tech or healthcare or whatnot. And, how do you basically spell out the ROI of what you do? And I'm always a little bit at a loss on how to answer that question, because like you, like the question, like, where do ideas come from? I remember being in a session with a bunch of NASA scientists, and this woman came up to me, and like, she was clearly brilliant, and she was asking about our process, being a visual strategist and doing something that similar to what Aaron's doing for us right now, that you all can see. And I gave her my answer, and I could see it was just so unsatisfying to her. There's too many gaps in it. It was too ambiguous. And what she was really looking for with some kind of a formula or some kind of process that she could understand, and I just was not able to give her the level of detail or maybe the scalability of the way we work that would satisfy her, her very analytical mind. So that is always something that we run into, and people ask us, kind of how do you go about, working with leadership in organizations that are clearly not creative thinkers necessarily in the traditional sense themselves, and are looking for some kind of ROI of your creative process. So I'm curious, when they asked you, Marisa, like, where does an idea come from, how did you answer that?
Well, the thing about creativity, and I don't know if other creative people that are listening to this feel this way, but I feel that sometimes, when we're going into those conversations, I'll think to myself for a second, like, well, what do I even know? Like, what is creativity? Like, what do I even really know? But then when you get into those conversations with people and businesses that are operating, I think you just take it for granted when you're creative or when you're in a creative environment every day that you know how these things work. So when but what I realize when I have those conversations is anyone who's creative or has worked in a creative industry is like, we do have a lot, and there's a lot of ways that the things that we do can help in other areas of business. So in that specific case where we were asked, what is an idea, you have to take it way back to the beginning, and what we said to them was like, the idea will start with what their goals are, what their business goals are, what their storytelling objectives are, who the audience is. We can start from there, and then we can figure out the seeds of the idea that's going to help push those objectives forward for them. Each one is different. It's hard to, an idea isn't just
Mhm.
something like, oh, here it comes from here. It has to come from a place. There's many places it can come from. It just sort of depends what you're trying to achieve first.
You just said, oh, I just go to my idea filing cabinet and I just pull
Yeah.
out one for you,
Right.
and there it is.
Let me pull out my hit file. I've been saving this one for a
Yeah, yeah.
while. But I also think like ideas, part of the process is in sharing the ideas. Like the development process is a lot of sharing and discussing these ideas. And you see when people start to spark to something, when they perk up, when they get really interested, and even within an organization, I think it's really smart to share as much information as you can. I mean, Marissa was always a tremendous advocate about for this at True TV, is not to develop creative ideas, in secret and hidden. It's like you share them with a broader organization because everyone's bringing a slightly different perspective. Whether you're a marketing person, whether you're a distribution person or a publicity person, they all have perspectives that are meaningful, and you can see what people are responding to and getting excited and enthusiastic about, and that helps inform the process a lot too. And great good ideas about how to make an idea better can come from everywhere.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like that holistic, organic approach to evolving idea is sometimes really counter to the quarterly calendars and processes that a lot of companies work under, right? So they think it's going to be like a concrete thing. Then you roll it out. You go through all these steps. It goes through marketing. It goes, it gets approved. It gets messaged and it gets sent out. Versus kind of an evolution, where maybe it's tested back to kind of being able to listen
Mhm.
and amplify your audience. So I don't know if you have any advice or stories around, how if our audience is working within an organization where that model isn't necessarily, um, is natural. What are some ways or some techniques to kind of take what you did, Marissa, in terms of opening it up and getting feedback while it's in development and while it's sort of being worked on?
I think in order to be something that we did at True that was excellent for us, in order to be quick to market these days and also to keep everybody excited about a project and to have that kind of buy-in that from all departments that builds momentum and really gets a project launched quickly. The second that we had developed and greenlit a show, before it went into production, we would have a meeting with the heads of every department and the creators of the show, and each department would introduce themselves, talk about where they would come in the process. They were able to ask the creators questions. They had already been, everyone had already, we'd shared information on the project, because at True, we would all, look, you're all running forward in the same direction, trying to do the same thing. Having that buy in early, so there's no surprises and secrets last minutes. Marketing can plan way ahead. Press can be thinking ahead. Ideas can percolate longer until they really hit those departments, but people know what's coming. And it would just rally the support, and the creators would greatly appreciate this approach because they would feel very supported in what they were making.
And they knew the machine in which they were working, right? And they would get a comfort level. They could be accessible to answer questions, and each of those departments felt that much more invested because they were connected to the project from the early stages. I've worked in networks where it didn't work that way. When your speed to market wasn't as close, you'd create a project, deliver it, then it would get processed by all these other departments, and eventually hit the air. You're so disconnected from it at that point, and those departments that are responsible for helping to promote it or distribute it or whatever are also not now connected to the creative process at the beginning. So everyone's working with a little less than they could have access to. But that communication, getting everyone on the same page at the same time, is something that I think people miss across many industries. One other thing that we instituted that I thought was super helpful is when we would develop an idea and we would green light it to go to pilot. You're going to go shoot one episode of it, right? The proof of concept. We would get on the phone with the creators right before shooting it and just say, okay, let's have one last conversation. I'm going to tell you the 5 reasons why I'm really excited about the potential of this project. This is why we're interested in this, and this is why we think it's a fit for the network. Now, you ask us any questions you have right now so that we're all on the same page, and then go make it, and good luck to you, right? And what that did was it sort of helped eliminate the game of telephone that happens in large corporations, where there's a head of the business, but then there's many people who are dealing with the project on the day to day. And over time, this game of telephone would happen, and all of a sudden, they're making a show that you weren't that excited about from the beginning. So it was a chance for us to clearly say, this is how we're going to judge this when it comes back to us. These are the goals. Um, and so that there was no miscommunication about that. And once we started doing that, more often than not, the projects that we started getting back were aligned with what our vision was for it and why we were excited. And we had a much higher green light ratio. More of those projects would go to series because they are on target. Something that happens in TV in particular a lot is you buy an idea, you're excited, they go and make the pilot, and by the time it comes back to you, it is unrecognizable from the idea that you initially bought. And so fixing that communication gap, um, just leads to better creative and also better ROI on the dollars you're spending. You're not wasting money making pilots that you're not picking up. And I'm sure that that translates to many other businesses as well.
So it sounds like, making sure that the people who are originally passionate about the idea get to communicate with the folks that are going to start executing it. And then to Marissa's point, that it's a lot of almost trust and transparency as something is rolling out to work across departments, and bring people in. And that kind of buy-in in the idea process, I think, is so true. And we see that at ImageThink too. And sometimes there's, in sessions of collaboration or brainstorming, back to what you said, Chris, which is like most ideas are not original, or really no ideas are original. That there's almost a value sometimes in going through the process of having people participate, even if the ideas that they're bringing up are not fully fleshed out, because you see that they then have a greater buy-in in the process when it does take shape,
Mm-hmm.
and more empathy with each other around the process, because they feel like they were contributors from the very beginning. I don't
Yeah,
know if
there's
you found
deeper
that.
investment. There's deeper investment and accountability to one another. You know, if somebody if a department that's responsible for supporting a project doesn't feel invested in it, it's sort of easy for them, or, particularly if you're stretched, overworked, to kind of do the bare minimum that you have to do, right? But if they've met the creators, that they've been in those conversations, if they're invested, if they know them, they're going to go down. It's just common sense. They'll go that much further. So the more you can connect people to it, include them, just the greater investment and return you're going to get.
But look, in TV, I'll say it's very common. Even, I had also worked at many networks where it's like we would develop a show and then I wouldn't see it again until it went onto the air.
Hmm.
Siloing, even in creative business, it's common because it's competitive and it's cutthroat and you feel like you have to keep your project secret for whatever reason. I would say I'm proud that we moved away from that. It did feel vulnerable at first to share early ideas. I think for my department, because pilots are works in progress. They are not perfect. You're just looking for a little spark there. And when you have to share them early, especially in a rough cut stage for what you feel is judgment, that's a very, it's a vulnerable state to be in as a
Hmm.
creative executive. However, what you find once you do with that transparency is you get so much more support behind it because people then see how far it evolves and they
Yeah.
become attached to it versus you just give it to them and they say, I hate this so much. It's terrible. And you kept it secret all this time.
Exactly. I
So,
think we're saying the same thing. And that's why sometimes, at sessions that we work with clients, we make sure that really senior people participate in part because they didn't have that empathy. They see where it came from. And this is great. We're really hitting on something because I see a bunch of comments coming in from the audience. One is Amanda Wong is sending out love to you,
Oh,
Marisa, and validating that that there was such creative collaboration, and that was what made the team at True TV so special. So, a
uh,
shout out to you. And another question we have on collaboration is from Steve Leviathan. He's Chief Executive Officer at Protocol Entertainment, and see that ideation as a truly as a team effort, and I think you do. But what is the role of a leader or a guide in that process?
listening, not bottlenecking the process, which a lot of leaders can do unintentionally sometimes. Listening, moving it forward, solving problems, getting buy in, maintaining momentum, and helping let creative people be creative, but also within the guardrails of what you're trying to achieve. You know, just that would be my answer. I don't know what you think, Chris.
I agree. First of all, hi, Steve. Um, I would also say, make it's the role of the leader to sort of shepherd the process and to make it a safe space. Because I think, I've been in development meetings and I know Marissa has that can be cutthroat, can be competitive and cutthroat. And in those situations, it's sort of like the most confident person's ideas are the only ones you're going to hear. But I think if a good leader makes it a safe space for everyone to contribute and finds ways to inspire everyone to contribute, and sometimes really out there, maybe even bad ideas lead to really good ideas. It's about getting it all out there, but then steering it in a way that as Marissa was saying, keeps it within those guardrails and leads it to something. The goal of a brainstorm is not to just throw a bunch of crazy ideas on the wall and leave them there. The idea is to get a bunch of ideas out and then start to focus the conversation and point it in a direction that leads to fruition. But making it a safe space for people to say something that's maybe sounds a little bit nuts, but then ultimately, becomes something. I mean, uh, Marissa, I think back to like when we were doing a live. We wanted to do a live event with the Impractical Jokers, and we're taught. We were sort of throwing out ideas about what we could do and what would make it being worthy of being live, or whatever. And they had Nick Walenda had just done that thing where he was walking across the Grand Canyon or something, and I was like, I don't know, they need to do something like walk a tightrope in New York City or whatever, which sounded nuts. And then over time we just kept referring to that more and more, like, well, it needs to be something big and eventful like that. And then ultimately that became the thing that we did. They walked a tightrope 8 stories up. And, after much back and forth with them telling us there's no way they could learn how to walk a tightrope. And we were like, sure you can. It can't be that hard. Come on. And then they ended up learning how to do it. And it ended up becoming, over 1 million people watched that special. But it all came out of sort of just throwing out crazy ideas to see, to keep elevating the conversation. And so you just never know.
I love that. I can't wait to see what Aaron does with that because it sounds to me more like it sounds to me like some kind of like metaphor, not that you actually had people walk a tightrope, but you're saying they walk the
Oh,
tightrope.
they did. Yes, they They did, and one of them actually did it and got all the way across, and it was an
What
awesome
happened
moment.
to the other people?
They didn't make it across.
Big safety net, big safety.
There was a tether in the net, but it was terrifying nonetheless. But it it's just like and that's just about like you got to sort of aim sometimes outside of what you think. I mean, obviously out of the box, but sort of aiming outside of what you think is your lane. And that's where we learn more. Again, talking about franchises, the elasticity of like, who would think a hidden camera prank show could suddenly have a live event with thousands of people in attendance and over 1 million people watching it live on air. It's like sometimes you just have to keep stretching the boundaries of what you think something can do, or just because it's outside the norm doesn't mean it's not that thing that will break through.
So, leadership's role is listening, making a safe space. Steve is not going to let you off the hook that easily, though, it sounds like,
Right?
because his next question is, what about how do you manage then the problem of too many cooks? Or is there such a thing as too many cooks? If it becomes truly more collaborative and you have all of these different departments looking in, giving feedback when it's in this nascent form, as you talked about, Marissa. And I appreciate that, because when you described that, I thought, as someone trained in art, there's a certain point where you don't want to let people in because you're still working it out, right? Because it can be really vulnerable and scary. So, how do you manage then that idea of when the feedback is kind of when you move past a point of feedback, or do you ever need to sort of uh, guide the project in a certain direction, or move it along in the process?
I agree completely that too many cooks is not good for creativity. I would say in what we were doing, there they were not becoming cooks. They were actually not sharing their. I think that there was a lot of respect because of the sharing. There was respectful boundaries in
Mhm.
everyone. We all respected what each other did in our own disciplines, and listen, if something was major and felt like it needed to be shared, it would. Otherwise, we were sharing these things as experts in programming so they could begin formulating plans for their individual departments. We were not sharing them for notes. um
But we did
and
often
you
share things
have to
for
be
feedback.
confident in what you're doing. Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. We would often share things though and receive feedback. Like I think collaboration doesn't necessarily mean a room of equals.
Hmm.
Being collaborative is sharing things at specific points for feedback, and then as the leader of that department, you take in the feedback that is relevant and meaningful, and you apply it, and you based on your expertise, you weed out those things that don't apply and don't make sense. But I think it's not collaboration amongst equals. It's collaboration amongst people with very specific expertise that you bring together at certain times. Sorry, I didn't mean to
Right.
interrupt.
So within their roles, you're collaborating, but you clearly understand sort of your piece of the recipe, if you will. Would you say
And
that's
look,
right?
I would receive, I don't, I didn't always love sharing everything. I don't want to make it sound like I was just like, let's share it all. Sometimes I didn't want to do it and I had to put a lot of caveats in front of it. Sometimes I would get feedback unsolicited that I did not need or appreciate, but part of it is just being able to say, I've received it, I've seen it, and now I'm going to take this so that it to the best place that I know, because again, this is my area of expertise, um, and not let this other noise drown out the ultimate purpose. But yes, it wasn't always certainly. I agree with Steve that like you are going opening yourself up to this, it can hit a nerve. But more often than not, I found that because people were invited in just to see what was going on, they feel less like they need to contribute, that they should or need to weigh in. It's more when there's secrecy or they feel like something's being kept from them that they want to poke at it a lot.
They also have greater context. The more
Mm-hmm.
context people have for why you're doing something the way you're doing it, the less you get misguided feedback. So one of the things we always tried to do was over communicate, provide as much context to everyone. Why are we pursuing this project? Why are we executing it the way we are? What purpose does it serve in the greater plan? And then people kind of relax, like, oh, okay, this makes sense, versus when decisions are made or things are carried forward in a void, then your minds go to crazy places, and they make up their own reasons for why things are the way they are, how they could have been, or etc. So I think just over communicating, providing context, also just smooths everything out.
Did that satisfy Steve?
It seems like it. It
Is
seems
that
like
enough?
Steve is satisfied.
He
Uh,
dropped off. He didn't want to hear any more about that.
um, It's been so great, and I appreciate all the questions, and we're trying to work all of them in. As you're posting, everyone out there on LinkedIn, thanks for joining us. A lot of curiosity and passion around the creative process and collaborating. But I'd love to get a chance to hear from Chris and Marisa a bit about storytelling and what you call long form storytelling, right? Because especially when you're talking about these franchises or these these sort of epic brands that were forged that you both worked on, you're talking about not just one story, but were they multiple stories, or do you see them as one long story arc? There's been a lot of talk about the power of storytelling in leadership and executive leadership, in brands as well. And so I'd be remiss if we didn't get a chance to kind of pick your brain a little bit about storytelling. So um, what do you consider, long form storytelling, and what are some of the structures that make it a success?
Do you want me to go? Do you want to go?
I mean, I think we can probably both jump in on this. I think when we're talking about long form storytelling, we're not talking about the storytelling that is done in commercials or short form branded content or marketing. All those mediums tell stories. We're talking about stories that play out in a longer way, and how they connect to the brand can be different. Red Bull does an incredible job of telling lots of stories that have built a culture around their brand. I think Hallmark has done an incredible job of, having a channel with a lot of long form stories that aren't, about cards, but there's a feeling, there's a connective tissue there. And I think with more and more platforms for distribution, more, ways that brands are creating content on their own platforms to interact with their fans, there's ways that they can be telling stories that aren't so on the nose as branded content, but that will, build up their fandom, build up affinity for their brands, and help them share their stories. So I think it can be in the way that we've been working, which is, in entertainment space on any platform. But we also see, when we left True TV, so many unexpected places reached out to ask us this very question: how can they tell their stories, and how can they connect with people? And that's, what we have really formed the consultancy around.
And I think the unique value of long form storytelling is the emotional connection that the viewer, the consumer, then makes with that story, and or that product. That's the value. That's what generates fandom around TV series or even sports. If you think of the Olympics, the first thing they start doing is telling the stories of the athletes, and in vignettes, and you get by the time the Olympics start, you're already invested, right? And you want to get to know those people better, and you want to see what happens, and you're invested in the outcome. And that's exactly what happens if you're a fan of Friends or drama or whatever. There's an emotional connection that happens that sticks with you, that often leads the viewer to evangelize for that product. It's created a feeling in them that they then often want to share with other people, and they want them to feel it too. And so that's an incredible power. That's what, sort of in a less cluttered world, that's what commercials did in the early days. You got a message, it affected you, and then it led you to take action. Now you're just being bombarded with so much messaging and so much information everywhere that it kind of just becomes noise. It just becomes mush. And so our philosophy is that it should be entertainment first, that anything that we create should be able to stand alone as entertainment, but then in an ideal world, either embody the attributes of that brand, be built within the world of that brand, somehow connect to that brand so that that brand is getting that positive rub. But we're not selling an individual message. We want to deliver that entertaining, connective experience that then benefits the brand as well. You're not just selling something to the viewer, you're serving them with actual content that's entertaining.
Mhm.
So, so you tell us about some examples that you feel like are really successful around that. You mentioned Hallmark, the Hallmark Channel having movies that aren't about cards but have some kind of sentimentality, I suppose. What else is out there besides, of course, the projects that you both worked on directly that you feel
Whoa.
that we might not necessarily think about as long form storytelling or entertainment that you think are delivering
But can I
that
say
kind
one thing about Hallmark that I always, we bring this up sometimes because I think it's fascinating. Because we had done some research on this. Like Hallmark cards were actually started, I think, in the early 1900s or something like that. They were designed to help illiterate men express emotion to their loved ones. That was the purpose for the cards. Was because most men couldn't write or were not able to vocalize their emotions, and so the cards became a way in which they could do that. That was really affecting. In many ways, the movies on Hallmark do the same thing now. Their largest audience is men, which is surprising, right? Most people right like that. Their demo that there are more men than women who watch Hallmark movies, and those men will tell you that the reason why they watch them is it is a safe space in which to feel emotion with their loved ones. And so it is this really fantastic example of how the brand attributes of that company were then translated into entertainment.
I mean,
Um,
you can all, there's big examples out there. When you look at Lego, you look at what Mattel is going to try to do. You see they're making a Flamin' Hot Cheetos movie. This isn't really about what money they're going to make from that movie. What it's about is like cultural relevance, getting people to talk about you, staying in the conversation, telling your story, right? There's a lot of different ways you can do it. Those are big examples, but there's also smaller things that can be done if you have your own subscription, if you're a delivery service for groceries, and you need to prevent people from turning over on that platform, starting to build out talent, starting to build out faces. I would say Peloton at this point, they have a captive audience who's obsessed with their brand. And by creating content around that talent, they could put it on their own platform and people will watch it. That is just added value that's getting people to spend more time, that's deeper engagement. And that's all just through stories of the talents and the personalities that they've already invested in.
like the Lego movie is a great example. That movie was not necessarily designed just to sell um, toys. Like it was a really really clever way to use those toys in a way that totally stood alone as entertainment. Whether there were actually Lego toys in the world or not, that was a really clever, funny, really satisfying piece of content. So I think things like that are the kind of things we look at for inspiration to say, how does something stand alone as entertainment, be super super satisfying, but then also build this affinity towards this brand or towards this product or this piece of talent.
I wanted to say something earlier when I think I left the meeting unintentionally, but I left for a second. But you were talking about what it takes to build that fandom or to launch that hit, and being nimble, us being able to nimble and respond. And one thing that I think is important, especially when talking to brands, is commitment on the part of the platform or network or brand who is putting out this content. If there is a spark there that you see in the first few episodes, you have to feed it and you have to stay with it, because Jokers was not built overnight. Real Housewives was not built overnight. These franchises, yes, there are still breakthrough in the moment shows, but even Ted Lasso, it started off slower. You have to commit
Look at
to
Schitt's
stuff that
Creek.
you know is good and that you think is good, and you have to invest in it, continue to push it, and stay the course. People get so frightened, and if it doesn't just right out of the gate do something, and just it doesn't work like that anymore. It takes people a minute to find things, and it also often takes even a buildup of episodes or content before you even feel like you want to waste your time, spend your time, not waste it, investing in it. Because if something is only there for a season, I will assume it is bad and I'm not going to start it. You know what I mean? So commitment, and kind of nerves of steel at the beginning. To not second guess and stay the course, I think is a really important thing because it's hard.
Yes.
That's great. I'm glad you circled back around and on that, because I think that that's something that we could on a couple of different fronts. Even if you're not listening right now, and you're not trying to make the next great Jersey Shore or the next great hit, is if you feel like you have something good, to stay committed to it, because there's a certain amount of momentum that you need, right? And um,
Yes.
we've heard now, I think it's been a decade or so, about how much overwhelm we have in terms of how much content everyone
Hmm.
sees every day, how much content we're being pushed, and that just seems to grow exponentially every year. So it sounds like, Marissa, what you're saying is that uh, things get lost, and it takes a while before something is going to have the traction or to resonate, and people shouldn't necessarily get discouraged if their first Medium article doesn't get a number of readers, or they don't have enough posts on their Instagram story, or if they're putting out something larger, even is
Hmm. It's
Yeah.
it
interesting. I
doesn't take
think
away from everyone.
with all of the messaging that we have access to, I actually think word of mouth is more important than it ever was, because you're just sort of tuning out so much of the messaging that you're seeing on television or on social media or whatever. I don't really start to engage with something until enough people have mentioned it to me. It's word of mouth that somehow gives things even greater validation. If you know that other people that you know and respect are sort of into something and are interested, then you're like, okay, now I'll give it a shot. And that just takes time. It takes time for that momentum to build up. That's why you have to stay with it.
So how do you manage then? I'm wondering if that becomes a challenge. Like, how do you, as kind of the creative producer, manage through that period, that sort of fallow period? Or if you're working with brands, how do you prep them for what might be, a less than ideal start? That they're not getting, they're not going viral. They're not getting,
Right.
this massive hit right out of the gate.
I think that's where a great research department comes in, right? Is that whether you're testing something, whether you're monitoring something on social, being able to monitor the sentiment, the responses that are happening. Oftentimes, if in the TV world, if something didn't get amazing ratings, but if you see it has nothing but positive sentiment, amongst the people who are seeing it, there's something there. You see a heartbeat. So I think companies need to invest in research or some way to be connecting with their audience. We had like a lab of people that our research department would regularly connect with on social media, where we could get direct feedback from fans, and they would tell us in very honest terms whether they liked something or didn't like something. And pretty early on whether or not there was a heartbeat and whether it was worth that investment. And I think having access to that so that you can then go to your higher ups and say, look, there's a reason that we're optimistic. This is not blind faith. There's some data to back it up. Let's stick with it, and hopefully, you see that grow over time. But you can't ask people to go strictly on blind faith. You do need to provide some sort of data to back it up. If you see a heartbeat, that's the reason to stick with it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that unless it's dead on arrival, which some shows certainly fall flat, some content just is not going to work and doesn't resonate. I mean, I would go further to even say, like, because first seasons are development, not just pilots. First seasons, if you behind the scenes see that a first season is getting stronger with each episode, it's finding its voice, it's finding its characters, and it's growing in the right direction, and there's a sign of life there, you need to just double down in order. There's no point in not doing a season two. You won't know. A lot of things hit their stride then. So um, as long as it's growing and getting stronger throughout that first seasons are development. They're
Right.
never they're rarely perfect.
Right. That's true. Especially now things are serialized. Usually the first episode, nothing really. It's like just
Mhm.
establishing the stage, right? So you really have
Yeah.
to commit as a viewer, even. Um, what about on the other side? What about brands or stories that have been successful and they've gone on for a while? Maybe this goes back to your tightrope story, Chris. What about sort of a storyteller having writer's block, or a group of creatives sort of running into how to manage kind of through multiple seasons or multiple franchises, or a brand with a long history that needs to say something new. What have you seen work in those situations?
I think it's often, Marisa mentioned this in the very beginning. I think it's often going back and connecting with your audience or with your consumers, and really understanding them. If you find that, your brand is getting stale, your messaging or stories are getting stale or are no longer resonating, it may very well be that your consumer base has shifted. I experienced this when I was at MTV, at a time when MTV had been on this really successful trajectory for a long time, and then it sort of started to take a dip, and shows started becoming less successful in like sort of the early 2000s. And Throughout the history of MTV, everyone sort of had this collective gut of what the audience wanted from MTV. And there was a time when all of a sudden that gut was no longer so in touch. And so for the first time, we really started diving into research and spending time with the audience and connecting with them. And we discovered that the audience had really changed. It had shifted. That was sort of when millennials were coming into the consumer base for MTV. And so we immersed ourselves in millennial culture to better understand their lives, how they spoke to each other, the issues that were important to them, so that all of the stories that we told were authentic to them. And it opened up all these new storytelling opportunities, and it opened up new ways that we could tell these stories that sort of helped MTV redefine itself, and led to one of the most successful periods in the network's history. So I'm always an advocate for going back and reconnecting with the audience, understanding how either their lives have changed or how their expectations for your brand may have changed. And out of that will come new opportunities, a new vocabulary, new ideas for execution.
Great. So
Marissa?
your audience itself may have changed, as an example, right?
Yeah, if you're no longer connecting, that may be, what it is, or you're just telling the same story over and over again and they've gotten bored with it, but get that feedback from that audience so that you can then be inspired to move in new directions.
All right. Well, Chris, Linn, Marisa, Ronca, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such a great conversation. We've covered collaboration, ways to do it. One of my takeaways is that collaboration doesn't have to be among equals, right? That everyone can know kind of their part, and that level of transparency and vulnerability and the creative process to bring people aboard can be really powerful. And actually, it sounds like Marisa says result in maybe less notes in the process. Walking the tightrope. I have to figure out what that's going to be an analogy for, but or literally walking the tightrope. And also just the importance, we see it with our clients too, connecting and knowing your audience, staying close to them, and then amplifying when you see fandom and passion and things taking shape. So those, for me, I'm just sharing a couple of my takeaways for all of you joining us on LinkedIn. Thank you. You also have Aaron's notes of our conversation. So big thanks to Aaron Maper, our visual strategist today, capturing the conversation. And for everybody, you need to keep track of what Chris and Marisa are doing. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And it was so interesting to hear all of your stories. So you can check them out on their website, as well as Contrast Media Consulting, as well as you can find them on all the platforms independently. Check out also their articles in Medium. There's some great ones there. I really enjoyed the one on leadership tips from RuPaul that Chris wrote recently. So thank you both for joining us. And for everybody, join us back here next month in December, where I will be talking to Rashid Oberlin. Had a fascinating conversation with him a couple months back, and really excited to have them. And also our earlier Ask the Experts, as well as hopefully our conversation today with Marisa and Chris, will be released as a podcast. So you can now get our next episode this Friday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Nora.